Phil and Claire. A few days ago, I found out that my Uncle Phil, my godfather and my father's eldest brother, died at the age of 87 on March 10th, 2020. The last time I saw him was perhaps 8 or 9 years ago when I went back to Boston from New York City for a rare visit. I had heard that he and his wife, my Aunt Claire, were living in South Weymouth, so I borrowed a friend's car and drove myself to their house. I did not call first. I decided to do the pop-in. Now, I know this annoys a lot of people, but at that time I had not seen them in years, and I was nervous. I wasn't sure they would be as eager to see me, so I risked the pop-in. I rang their doorbell, sweating on their steps in a hot pink dress I had chosen, knowing my Aunt Claire would approve. She came to the door first, then he did. She said, "My God," and then she turned to Phil and said, "It's Lisa, your goddaughter." For a moment, I thought I might have changed so much that he did not recognize me. But as Claire opened the screen door, he said, "Hey, hey, Lisa!" I put that thought out of my mind. Their expressions were ones of shocked delight. They welcomed me into their home, as they had always done, and we walked through to the kitchen, the beating heart of most Italian homes. Even at 80, sitting at his kitchen table with Claire, Phil's hair was still black and curly, a bit of gray visible only in his mustache. He was always in good shape, and that had not changed. Only his skin tone was a bit lighter, from deep olive to pale. Claire had lost some of her plumpness. Her once long black hair was now streaked with gray and cut short. But apart from the gray, neither looked as if they had aged much. Claire made coffee and brought out homemade pastries, which I declined. No gluten for me. Then she asked if I wanted to try her meatballs. How could I refuse? She heated them up with a bit of sauce, and her kitchen began to smell like it did in the Braintree house, the party house of my childhood. When I was a little girl, my father took me to every party my aunt and uncle threw, every birthday, anniversary, first Holy Communion, baptism, confirmation, graduation. In addition to my father, there were 3 more aunts, 1 uncle, and countless cousins, so there were many parties. Phil and Claire's house in Braintree became the party house of choice. It had a sprawling sitting room where usually a football game, a baseball game, or a show deemed wholesome entertainment, like the Waltons or Little House on the Prairie, was always playing on the enormous television set. There was, however, an exception. The first time I saw The Godfather Parts 1 and 2 also was in Phil and Claire's house. All of the men in the Del Rosso family loved that film. My father, in particular, got a kick out of the fact that Michael Corleone turned out to be, as he said, worse than the father. So after watching the film, I was baffled as to how it had gotten by the alleged wholesome censor. Though this was yet another adult contradiction that I knew not to question. Claire's large kitchen regularly smelled of her red sauce, her manicotti, stuffed shells, her ricotta pie, the latter of which I still make today using her recipe. In their rumpus room, the older cousins hung out around a pool table and occasionally snuck a beer inside the pocket of a leather jacket. The parlor was elegant, looked as if Marie Antoinette had decorated it, and then decided to throw a plastic covering over the sofa, and no one, especially the children, was allowed in that room. Part of the land their house sat on was woods. Now I think this would be called conservation land. But another part had been transformed into an epic in-ground pool where when it was very hot, everyone else would stay indoors, enjoying the air conditioning and watching through the huge bay window as my uncle, fit and trim in a very small bathing suit, reclining on a lounge chair beside the pool, baked his already dark olive body in the sun. "I swear he's part Arab," Aunt Claire said once, shaking her head. Phil did indeed love the sun, loved getting as deeply tanned as possible, and in fact resembled Omar Sharif. I loved those parties. I don't think I ever felt so connected to family, so clearly understood what La Famiglia e Tutto meant, and learned about banter and gossip and brotherly love and how incredibly frustrating it was that the adults spoke in Italian when they didn't want the children to understand what they were saying. Envy and loyalty, all accompanied by my aunt's amazing food. When my parents divorced, my father continued to take me and my 2 younger sisters to Phil and Claire's. After his second marriage, nothing changed. But after he managed to get the marriage to my mother annulled and got remarried again in the Catholic Church, suddenly the parties at Claire's stopped. I was about 13 or so at the time. And when I questioned my father as to why, he said that she and Phil didn't want to see us anymore. As it was a result of the divorce, he said, and he blamed my mother. Years later, when I was home for Thanksgiving from studying abroad in London, I borrowed a car and parked by Claire's house, the party house in Braintree, and they were still living in. I was 19 or 20. She and Phil welcomed me into their home. In the past, I had never had many conversations with Phil. I had more admired him as a bronze, smiling god who bantered back and forth with Claire, though Claire usually won. Phil returned to his chair in the sitting room, and Claire made coffee for us. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table and asked about what I was doing in London. Her daughter, my cousin Diana, who was 12 or 13 at the time, came out from her bedroom and sat next to Claire to examine me, a cousin she had not seen in years. Diana asked what London was like, and my aunt said, "It's foggy, not a lot of sun, but there's a lot of moisture in the air, and that's why the women have such beautiful skin." She smiled at me. We talked a bit more, and finally I asked, "Claire, why did you stop inviting us to your house for parties?" She said, "Lisa, I never did." I said, "My father stopped taking us. He said you didn't want to see us anymore." Claire said slowly, "Lisa, your father told us that you didn't want to come here anymore." I said weakly, "You could have called?" But I knew that would not have been possible. She said, "Lisa, you know I couldn't have called your mother's house. Your father hated her with a passion. Then I'd be fighting with my husband's brother. You see?" I did see. But all I wanted to do was break down and cry. How could I have been so stupid to believe my father? How could I have taken him at his word? My Aunt Claire had unusual eyes, black, like her hair that she always piled on top of her head in a messy bun back then. So black that you could barely see the pupils. Usually they were upturned at the sides because she was always smiling, always laughing or making a joke. At that moment, though, I saw the realization of all those lost years, lost time, that betrayal, and the black eyes I stared into smoldered like she could kill someone. I said, "That fucking son of a bitch." Shaking her head, she said, "You got that right." We did stay in touch after that. I don't think she was particularly happy that I chose to study in London or eventually chose to live there. Why not travel around your own country instead? Because that meant I was far from family. I did not tell her that was part of the reason I stayed in London, though we both knew we wanted each other in our respective lives. How could I explain to Claire that I was haunted by a past I could not shake? That her house was an oasis of lush life, while mine had only ever compressed me within its walls? How could I say that the house I grew up in was chaotic once my parents' marriage went south, full of angry voices and fighting, and I remembered my father's rage more than his laughter? That I had learned how to behave to avoid getting hit. By the time I was 7, my father had chosen another target, my younger sister, who got far worse than I ever did. On another visit to Aunt Claire's from London, I asked, why wasn't it me who got beaten the most, I meant? Now, Claire's house was not perfect, and Phil, the disciplinarian, also believed in corporal punishment. I had witnessed that myself with one of his sons, but never with his daughter. She knew what I was asking. Claire said, "Lisa, you were such a strong-willed little girl, you would have run away." I guess by going to London, even to study singing, even though I'd earned that opportunity by audition, it was also a form of running away. I just didn't know it at the time. After Claire had poured me another cup of coffee, post-delicious meatballs, she sat down and said, "Phil is going blind." "Oh no," I said, shocked because I had not noticed. Claire said, "There's nothing they can do. It's degenerative." Phil said, I memorized the layout of the house so I can get around pretty good. I can see shapes and outlines. Sit next to me so I can see your face. Now I understood why Claire had told him who I was at the door. He couldn't see me. Claire functioned as his eyes, leading him through the rooms to sit down, going down the basement if he wanted, reading to him, and this seemed to work. Their ease together was pretty amazing. All told, they were married for over 60 years. During the explaining of all this, Phil, the eternal optimist, never sounded defeated. A lot of that had to do with Claire. They asked me about New York City, where I had resettled after 10 years in London. Then carefully about my personal life. Now, are you still married? We got onto the rest of the family. So many stories I could not keep straight. Then my uncle said, your father calls me a few times a week from the mountain in Vermont. He's lonely. He says he misses his family. Oh, I said. I had neither seen nor heard from him in about 10 years. Yeah, said Phil. He misses being close to his family. I think he's going to move down here soon. I said, oh, really? Phil said, yeah, I almost got him convinced. I said, what about his wife? Phil said, she got no choice. I said, well, I hope you're right. Phil said, he'll do it. He'll move. I tell you, he's lonely. I knew this would never happen. I asked for Claire's coffee, the smell of it bringing me back in time to her Braintree kitchen, and laughter and teasing in the hubbub of family. As I was leaving and we were exchanging hugs and kisses, Phil said, Lisa, after you leave, I'm going to call your father, tell him you stopped by. I'm going to tell him you look beautiful. And it's going to make him so happy to hear that you stopped by. Laughing, I cut him off and I said, no, Phil, please don't do that. Please don't call him, please. Taken aback, he said, why not? I said, still laughing, because he doesn't give a shit. He really doesn't. And that's okay. I've come to terms with it, and it really is okay. Phil said, no, Lisa, it's going to make him happy, and he's going to call you. I laughed harder. Phil, he's not going to call me. I told you, he doesn't give a shit. That's why he stays in the mountain in Vermont, away from family, and does what his wife wants him to do. Phil said, I'm going to call him anyway, and you'll see. I said, you're wasting your breath. I love you both. It was wonderful to see you. Wonderful. I hugged and kissed them again, said goodbye, and hopped into my friend's car. That was the last time I saw them both. Claire died suddenly in January 2016. My sister Chris found out only a few months after, online, and was furious that no one had contacted us. But I was not surprised. Phil must have been lost without her. I believe one of his sons moved in to look after him. My father never moved to South Weymouth. He never came down from the mountain because he misses his family. He never called after I visited Phil and Claire. None of that surprised me either. I do miss Phil and Claire. And everything they gave me while I was growing up. They shared a house full of life, of raucous, rippling laughter. They always gave without asking for anything, and my aunt worked full-time in a bank. My mother said she didn't know where Claire got the energy. I knew, though. I knew. Claire knocked herself out. She cleaned the house and prepared and cooked all the food. That food, for one reason and one reason only. Because she wanted to. She liked making people happy. She made my uncle happy. And he made her happy for over 60 years. If my father ever made one single person happy, I don't know about it.